Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our very last session of our August summer series at the Riverside Church called What Do Theologians Have to Say to the Church Today? And today we're joined by theologian Dean Kelly Brown Douglas. We are so glad to welcome Dean Douglas and all of you to our Zoom room this morning for an hour of learning together and conversation. I'll give a brief introduction of Dean Douglas and then we'll jump right in, and I'll put some links in the chat for her full bio and other information about the series. So the very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas was named Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary and Professor of Theology at Union in September 2017. She was named the Bill and Judith Moyers Chair in Theology in November 2019, and she also serves as the Canon Theologian at the Washington National Cathedral and Theologian in Residence at Trinity Church, Wall Street. Dean Douglas is widely published in national and international journals and other publications. Her groundbreaking and widely taught book, Sexuality in the Black Church, A Womanist Perspective, was the first to address the issue of homophobia within the Black church community. Her latest book, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies in the Black Church, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, examines the challenges of stand your ground culture for the Black church. Dean Douglas's upcoming book is called Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. The book looks at how do we really know that God cares when Black people are still getting killed? How long do we have to wait for the justice of God? And the quote says, "I get it that Christ is Black, but that doesn't seem to be helping us right now." It says these questions are from her son that prompted her to undertake this soul-searching reflection. So let us give a warm Riverside welcome to the very Reverend Dr. Dean Kelly Brown Douglas. Thank you, Dean Douglas, for being with us this morning. Really looking forward to having you today.
Thank you, Reverend Lamb, and all of you who are up on a August Sunday morning, getting that last, I guess, weekend of perhaps summer vacation before Labor Day. So I appreciate you being with us this morning and appreciate you having me with you in conversation. And I emphasize conversation because I hope we do have a conversation. I would just spend a few minutes sort of laying out some things in terms of trying to answer this question of what it means to be church, or as we reflect upon church, and then in these times in which we find ourselves. And then I will open it up to questions and conversation with you. But it's so good to be with you all, and can't wait till we can all be back together in person in some way, shape, or form. But virtual have to do for now. So let me begin. As we think about what it means to be church in these times, let me say something about these times, affirming that which you already know, and then the challenge of our trying to be church at such a time, as they would say, it's in the biblical witness, is such a time as this. First of all, I don't need to tell you, and simply to affirm that we find ourselves in a time where, of course, over the last 2 years, now almost 2 years, two pandemics have converged. The pandemic that is the health crisis of COVID-19, and the long ignored pandemic that is white supremacist racism. These two pandemics have converged in such a way, as we know, that has left people of color, particularly people in the African-American community, disproportionately impacted by the health pandemic that is COVID-19. And so people of color have been disproportionately impacted because we hear consistently about the fact that they carry more comorbidities that make them not simply more susceptible to the virus itself, but more susceptible to being hospitalized and indeed fatality, dying in relationship to COVID-19. Now, when we speak of these comorbidities, this begins to bring into clear relief the long-standing pandemic that is that of white supremacist racism. Because even as we speak of comorbidities in terms of, we hear people talking about it in terms of diet and obesity and hypertension, etc. Those are the comorbidities that the comorbidities of white supremacist racism have created. And that means the conditions of living and to which people of color, particularly Black people, are disproportionately trapped, like poverty, with its comorbidities of lack of opportunity for housing, educational, job, healthcare, etc. Those create a whole cycle of these other kind of health concerns, if you will, that have produced the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 has played upon the African American community. At the same time, it's those things, this pandemic that is white supremacist racism is violent, creating a cycle of violence. And so by the time we see this violence that spills out onto the streets in various neighborhoods in which people of color are disproportionately trapped, again, that is a reflection of the pandemic that has been long since been ignored. But that's not what I want to talk about today. We might get into it in discussion. What I want to focus on is, so what does that mean for who we are, who we claim to be as church? So I have said on many occasions, some of you may have heard me say, and I've certainly written about, that as we have seen these two pandemics converge in our nation, this time I like to call a Kairos time. And many of you, I'm sure, is familiar with this term of Kairos, is aptly stated by South African clergy and theologians in their 1998 Kairos document. This time for us of the convergence of two pandemics is a movement of grace and opportunity. A favorable time, as they said, in which God issues a challenge to decisive action. Yet, as this document goes on to say, it's a dangerous time. It's a dangerous time because if the opportunity is missed and allowed to pass by, then the loss for the church, as well as wider society, is immeasurable. I want to focus on this loss for the church, but let me emphasize again what I sort of mean by Kairos time is a time, yes, of crisis, but it is a time of opportunity. An opportunity to begin to respond to what it is that God is calling us to do, even as God, and to what God is calling us to be. So it is a time for decisive action. What is God calling us to be in this our Kairos time? God is calling us to be church. God is calling us to be church. And so if we miss that opportunity, then indeed we have failed to live in to the claim that we make. And that is the claim that we are church, because my underlying assumption is this: to call ourselves church is aspirational. We have yet to live fully in to that aspirational claim. What makes this even most clear is that even as we talk about the convergence of these two pandemics, and we talk about, in particular, the pandemic that is white supremacist racism and the racial inequity and racial injustice and the anti-Blackness that has been a result of that white supremacist racism, guess what? All of this injustice, all of this inequity happened on our watch. At the very time, the very watch when we have claimed to be church. So what is it? Not that we could correct all of that. But what is it that we have to be called accountable to in this our Kairos time? How are the ways in which perhaps we have failed in being church? And what are the ways in which we can continue to live into this claim that we make of ourselves as church communities, as faith communities? So let me say a couple of things about what it might look like to begin to live into this aspirational claim. Who we are as a Christian church community means that we have at the very center of our being as church an incarnate, crucified Savior. And as I often like to say, so we ought to act like it. We ought to act like it. What does it mean to have an incarnate, crucified Savior at the center of our faith tradition? First thing that it seems to me that it suggests to us is that what it means for us to follow, to heed this incarnate, crucified Savior is that we ourselves must embody our faith, embody what it means to be church, incarnate what it means to be church in the world. I'll say something about that in a minute. So it's not, it's not about when we talk about being people of faith, for us, it's not about the beliefs we have. It's not about dogma. It's not about doctrine. It's about really kind of doing what Jesus did, not kind of doing it. Partnering with God in an effort to mend the earth. Or put another way, partnering with God to close the gap between the way things are and the way they're supposed to be. To join is, in my faith tradition, our presiding bishop is called the Episcopal Church into joining the faith, the Jesus movement. And most people that aren't Episcopalian will say to us, so what have y'all been doing all along? That he's got to call y'all into the Jesus movement. Well, that's a good question, but that's a question for all of us who claim to be church, following Jesus. And so to join that movement as church means that we are indeed following Jesus and partnering with God. And Jesus was God incarnate, but partnering with God and trying to close the gap between our unjust present and God's promise for a more just future. That's what Jesus was. He witnessed to that in an embodied way. I'll get to that. It's not about, do you believe in this, that, or the other, some doctrinal claims about Jesus. It's about doing what Jesus did in relationship to bringing the gospel message alive, the gospel good news of God's more just future, trying to close that gap. It's the first thing. The other thing, he was crucified. Now, I often like to say, because it's true, he wasn't crucified because he prayed too much. It was perhaps because he prayed that he was able to take up the cross. But he didn't get on the cross because he prayed too much or because of the doctrines that he held, etc. He was crucified because he was an embodied witness to God's more just future. Now, in being crucified, it indicated without a shadow of a doubt that the way to that more just future, that gospel good news that he preached, is through the cross. What's that mean? It begins with the crucified classes of people. Jesus, the fact that Jesus was crucified affirms his utmost, uncompromising solidarity with the crucified classes of people in his day. And that didn't begin on the cross. I mean, that's why we have the story that says that Jesus was born in a manger. He was born on the margins, he was born as an outcast. God entered into our world, not in position of power, but on those who were on the outside, marginalized, the outcast. Jesus' whole ministry was about that. And we know his first public sermon, as Luke presents it to us in chapter 4, says that I have come to set the captives free. He came to liberate the oppressed. It makes clear to us that if we are to understand the way toward this more just future that God calls us to be in partnership with God and moving toward, then it has to begin with those who have been on the outside, underside of justice, the crucified classes of people in our own time. Because here's the thing, I always say, if it doesn't begin there, because these are the people who they know the realities of justice and they know what justice looks like. Otherwise, if it doesn't begin there, we begin to confuse justice with the privileges that we receive from an unjust world, unjust systems, unjust structures. Those on the underside and outside of that, they don't confuse that. So it's no accident that we have a crucified, incarnate Savior at the center of our faith tradition. So, as Jesus witnessed in an embodied way, obviously, to God's more just future and what that would look like, so too are we called to witness to that. If we are ever going to begin to live into the aspirational claim that we are church. What does it mean to witness to that? It means not simply protesting against that which indeed is contrary to this just future that God calls us to, though protest we must, against the systems and structures and cultural and ideological realities that say that there are some people more deserving of God's love and justice than others. We can talk about that in particularity later, if you'd like. But it also means, even as we protest against, witness against things, that we have to witness for. What does that more just future look like? And so we have to begin to create within our space that we call church, within our communities, etc. We have to begin to create the kind of spaces, the kind of realities that point toward and suggest the kind of future that God calls us to. And again, that starts with being proximate. That's the other thing that we must do, to borrow from Brian Stevenson's word in Just Mercy. It begins with proximity, being proximate to the crucified classes of people in our own time, as Jesus was. Listening, learning from them about the complex realities of injustice and what indeed a just future might look like for them. If we get that right, we know that we are at least, as to borrow from the words of Martin Luther King, who borrowed them from Theodore Parker, we would know that we would at least then be on the arc that bends toward justice, that justice, which is the justice of God. So let me sort of see if I can summarize what I've said, and then we can open it up, because said a lot quickly, and I don't know that I've said it in a comprehensible way, but I hope so. And that is that we are in a Kairos time. This time where two pandemics have come together. In such a time as this, we are being held accountable to the claim we have made. We have made a claim that we're church. We have made a claim that as church, we are followers. We are part of this Jesus movement, if you will. To be a part of that movement, hence making that claim to be church, means that we must take seriously what it meant for Jesus to be an incarnate reality of the God we claim to serve and to have been crucified. And so we are called to be embodied witnesses to that very movement that led the one at the center of our faith to be crucified. And that does indeed mean being a witness against and for, against that which is not for Jesus' just future. And such a witness begins in solidarity, in proximity with crucified classes of people in our own day. And in the end, as people of faith who've accepted the invitation from God to partner with God in mending the earth, we are to be accountable, not to the way things are, our present unjust realities, and the ways in which we try to maintain a status quo, if you will, but we are to be accountable to the way things are going to be. And that's accountable to the gospel good news that is God's just future.